These couch experts, what will happen to them? Fortunately, we all live in a democratic country. I hope so. I believe it.
How Freedom House see martial law in Ukraine?
We had urged the government to only institute those limitations which were absolutely necessary.
We're taking your property. The rights and restrictions referred to in the Legislative Act will not be applied. In the Kharkov and Odessa regions, this is not possible. The specifics of politics in the territory of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, everything is spelled out there.
As a political game?
A lot of public discussion about the reason that martial law...
Explain the difference, please. What can and can't be done? Freedom of speech is not forbidden in our country. Okay, we'll keep that in mind.
Hello, I present today a new episode of program EuroIntegrators, and our guest today is Director of Freedom House of Ukraine, Matthew Schaaf. Hi, Matthew.
Hello.
And Deputy Head of CIMIC Department of Armed Forces of Ukraine, Volodymyr Liamzin. Hi, Volodymyr.
Hello.
Matthew, first question is to you. How Freedom House see martial law in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, Freedom House is a human rights organization that defends human rights, defends democratic institutions. So our key concern about anything is human rights and democracy and the impact of a policy or development on human rights and democracy. And martial law in Ukraine is no different. We're not in a position to say whether this measure was necessary or not, but we did feel it was necessary to encourage the Ukrainian government, to encourage the military to limit any restrictions of human rights in Ukraine during martial law. And so it's not a secret that the President's order and the order of the Security and Defense Council does talk about possible limitations of human rights. And we had urged the government to only institute those limitations which were absolutely necessary during the time of martial law.
How much your organization is able to monitor human rights and freedom of speech in regions with a martial law?
Our presence and office here is quite small, and like all of the work that we do, the advocacy work, the research work, the programmatic work, we work with Ukrainian civil society organizations, with the government and with others. So all of the monitoring that we've been doing has been in cooperation with Ukrainian human rights activists, human rights defenders, and others. Certainly we've been following media reports just like everyone else, but I think there's a growing understanding both within Freedom House and within our partners that there needs to be more done to understand how martial law is affecting people, and that means not only the specific provisions of martial law and the authorities that it gives to the government, but also how people in these regions are perceiving the impact of martial law. So, for example, we've heard that many people don't understand, okay, well, martial law, it sounds bad. What does it mean for me? Does it mean that men will come to my apartment and like try to take something? What do I do when, if these men come? And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it means. And so that's one of the things that we'll be doing in the future is trying to strengthen the capacity, our own capacity and capacity of Ukrainian civil society to be following these things, to understand what is happening and how it is affecting people, and as I said before, their rights and participation in democratic society.
All right, Volodymyr. Then here's a question for you. Is it possible then that the military or some other official could walk into someone's home and say, in effect, we're taking your property? At the present time, as you're aware, the Ukrainian president has issued an official statement asserting that the rights and restrictions referred to in the Legislative Act will not be applied at this time. In the case of open aggression by the Russian Federation, if the situation is exacerbated, it's possible that under extenuating circumstances and only after the relevant regulatory acts are passed, these rights may be applied by the military at a state level. But at this time, there's no discussion or question of military personnel entering a private home or commandeering it in the name of, let's say, military necessity. The problem is, the law doesn't specify that this can take place only in cases of acts of aggression by land. It simply says that certain rights may be restricted, and they're pretty serious and numerous rights. Why do you think that international organizations are following this particular situation so closely? Yes, in Article 8 there are 24 points outlining various individual restrictions. Additionally, it specifies which articles of the Constitution may be suspended or curbed, and in what way. Again, I'll say this is currently not under discussion at all. At present, there is no need for the military to occupy civilian premises. In fact, we have a current example we can look at, how operations are conducted in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. There are already certain mechanisms in place there. And if we're talking specifically about the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, then yes, this is possible under certain circumstances. As far as the rest of the territory of Ukraine, it's not a question at all. But in order to do this in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, is an additional legislative act needed or not? No, this is all spelled out in the law, in what is called the Donbas Integration Act. That is about the specifics of politics in the territory of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Everything's spelled out there. Could this happen, for example, in the Kharkiv and Odessa regions, excluding situations where it's authorized by additional bylaws? Unquestionably, there should be an act or bylaw passed in such cases. As I said, this isn't being discussed at present, so there's no need or basis for it right now.
What can we learn from your organization's experience in other hotspots of the world?
There haven't been that many cases of countries recently instituting martial law, but there have been some. For example, with Egypt and the Philippines, and I believe also Ethiopia, and these are countries that we also follow. But they're also countries that are different than Ukraine in many ways. And it would be good for Ukraine to continue to be different from the systems and the governments in those countries. What we've seen is that these type of special powers can be misused by governments for political purposes to accomplish other goals other than the ones that are specifically mentioned in the emergency law or the martial law or whatever it's called. And so that's one of the reasons why we had also in our statement after martial law was imposed was not only to call on taking those extreme measures, only those that are absolutely necessary, but to be transparent about it and for restrictions to be justified. And so it, in our opinion, is not enough to just say there is aggression from Russia, so we need to limit enjoyment of all these constitutional articles. But what needs to happen is if there's a threat of some sort and it requires some kind of extraordinary measure, for that to be publicly stated, for the justification to be publicly stated, and for the connection between the limitation that is being taken and the justification to be very clear. So not talking in generalities or abstractly, but to make clear connections for why this measure is absolutely necessary right now. And so that's one way to avoid potential abuses of extraordinary powers like this.
Do you mean that such things like a martial law could be used as a political game?
It can be, for sure. In some of the countries that I mentioned before, that has happened, not only for political purposes, but also for the purpose of putting pressure on civil society, for the purposes of putting pressure on political opponents. I'm not saying that's what's happening in Ukraine. Although there has been a lot of public discussion about the reason that martial law was introduced, and also discussion about potential political connections. And I think it's really important that those discussions happen, actually. That's the sign of a democracy, or one of the signs of a democracy, is that even in very challenging times, people are asking hard questions, are questioning steps that the government is making, steps that the military is taking, and so that's a good thing.
Martial law is already in effect for more than a week. Do you have any concrete examples of some citizens' rights violations, or opposite, some examples of how martial law help you to stand against Russian aggression?
In the first place, as our president recently stated, martial law was introduced in order to arm and outfit Ukrainian servicemen. And in the week after martial law was introduced in Ukraine, there have been, shall we say, certain grounds for the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine to be able to use weapons, if necessary, outside the area of the United Forces operation. That is, if before this the legal basis for the use of weapons was only on the territory of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, where the hostilities are taking place, now we have legal grounds for servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine to legally use their weapons on all territories where martial law has now been enacted. Additionally, the armed forces of Ukraine were brought to a higher level of combat readiness than they had been before. Of course, the procedures that are currently taking place in the armed forces of Ukraine are aimed at creating the most optimal conditions for confronting a possible enemy invasion. Which procedures, if you can talk about this? Do you mean reservist meetings? I mean all the activities of everyday life which are carried out in the Ukrainian armed forces, military personnel training, equipment preparation, and other routine activities.
Okay. So
there are a lot of questions that people have, and unfortunately not a lot of answers. In terms of official measures being taken to restrict people's rights, I'm not aware of these types of measures, although I've heard a lot of rumors, and I've seen also statements by government officials, by members of the parliament, by local government officials about restrictions. Some of our partners operate hotlines, and they have also now started accepting calls from people in the other, not just Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, but also in the other regions that are where martial law was instituted. And so far, and I don't have the most up-to-date data, there were just a lot of questions about, well, what does this mean for me, and what do I do if this happens? And so, one of our main concerns is without a strong understanding of what martial law means for people and how it will change their lives and whether restrictions of their rights are actually enforced or not, the concern is that people will stop doing things that they would normally do as part of their lives, that they would restrict their participation in public events, that they would not participate in public discussions certainly about the conflict, but also about anything else, out of fear or not knowing, what's okay and what's not in the current environment. So in this environment where people don't really understand, there, in my opinion, needs to be a lot more effort to communicate to people about, okay, well, what does this mean for you? Are any rights being restricted, or are they not, and so on. This also needs to happen with government officials too. I've seen some statements by government officials that, for example, all public demonstrations in our region are now banned. I've seen also from local government officials similar types of statements. I have heard of new blog posts being put up in regions where they hadn't existed before. But as far as I understand it, there haven't been any particular restrictions on freedom of expression, for example. So we're waiting and seeing, basically.
At
this time, Freedom House is receiving a lot of inquiries about the lack of government information on this, about what will or could happen in this or that region, because they're saying that new roadblocks or blog posts have appeared. They're talking about the work of mass media. If the work of mass media will be affected by this, and in which areas. In what way personal privacy and privacy of correspondence could also be affected. Could you please tell us in more detail about which rights could theoretically be limited? But as far as I understand, we have not only 2 regions under martial law and 10 which aren't. But we also have 2 more regions which are under additional legislative restrictions due to current aggression. Explain the difference, please. What has or hasn't been restricted in those 2 and in the other 10 regions? Firstly, at this time there's no talk about introducing particular restrictions, those specified in the law concerning freedom of movement or freedom of speech. Again, right now the main focus is something which concerns every ordinary citizen. This is about the recent announcement from General Headquarters of the Ministry of Defense through official channels, advising all Ukrainian citizens not to publish information about military movement, about where military units have been deployed. I would like to appeal again to our citizens. We have a very powerful force in our community, in our country. We call them sofa experts, who really enjoy commenting either through social media or sometimes on television or at speeches, expressing their opinions. These people who are very far from actual military affairs but consider themselves experts and comment in such a way which disadvantages the reputation of the armed forces of Ukraine. I would like to avoid this. I'll say again that we aren't talking about restricting correspondence or about censorship. But in the interests of national security, if necessary, we do have certain structures, certain bodies, public institutions related to this which will carry out their work exclusively within the framework of the legislation of Ukraine.
В нас є перелік державних установ, які мають до цього відношення, які будуть виконувати свою роботу, виключно в межах законодавства України, звичайно.
At this time, can they already do this in the 10 regions or only in 2, or is it not possible even there?
Ну, я би не хотів коментувати, скажімо.
I'd rather not comment on the activity of other security institutions or law enforcement authorities.
Те, що стосується обмеження пересування громадян.
As for the restriction of the movement of citizens, again, there's no question of this. However, every law-abiding citizen who's on the military register must inform the military commissariat when changing his place of residence.
Він повинен повідомити військовий комісаріат. Тобто це право, які при переїзді з одного місця на інше. Те, що стосується...
What about the roadblocks which appeared in the other regions? These are definitely not military roadblocks. Which ones are we talking about? In the areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, on the contrary, since 30th of April, since the beginning of the United Force operation, the number of roadblocks has been optimized. They were reduced from nearly 150 to now about 50 of them.
Навпаки, кількість блокпостів була зменшена. Якщо буде така необхідність, то, звичайно, певні блокпости будуть з'являтися. На даний час такої необхідності нема.
Ну, я розумію, що це були скоріше блокпости поліцейські.
I understand that these were most likely police checkpoints in front of Vinnytsia, I heard.
Мається на увазі не блокпост, мається на увазі, ну, я так
Yes, this meant not actual roadblocks, but checkpoints set up by the national police. They have their own work and directives. Of course, in these areas of Ukraine, they are on an enhanced mode of operation. This is absolutely normal in this kind of situation.
Відносно Донецької і Луганської області. Правильно я розумію, що
Regarding the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, if I understand correctly, the decision to occupy civilian housing, for example, if it's necessary to conduct military operations in a particular building, is this made on the spot by the commander? What is currently taking place in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions has been the case since the beginning of 2014. That is, during this time, there have been certain incidents at certain moments. Someone was right and someone was wrong. Now again, right now, there is no need to discuss this. At this point, the troops are almost standing still. That is, the front line of conflict hardly moves. No one is actively moving forward at this time. So it won't happen that people will be evicted from their homes or premises by servicemen for military necessity? Yes, there's no need for that. Will this be true in the other regions as well? Yes, it will. I think that's a very important question. That's absolutely an important question. I would like to emphasize again that there's no need for that at this time.
Article 34 of Constitution of Ukraine by this law was actually limited. It's freedom of speech part. Does it mean that average citizen doesn't allow to criticize armed force of Ukraine or decision about martial law?
Ну, по-перше, ми з вами живемо.
First of all, fortunately, we all live in a democratic country. I hope.
Я в це вірю.
Yes, I believe this.
Да, і тобто кожна людина має
Every individual has freedom of speech.
Ми звертаємося з проханням.
But we do make requests and give recommendations. We aren't just saying, no, that's forbidden to talk about.
І знову ж таки,
And again, what people say, what someone writes about troop movements, or when someone expresses their opinion, this won't be investigated by the Ukrainian armed forces. Every word said or written will be evaluated by other institutions. We merely recommend and request not to post information about the army movements, which is especially important in the regions where martial law was introduced. There won't be any action by the Ukrainian armed forces against the individuals who share this information. It's not the job of the Ukrainian armed forces. That's not our function or directive. And if there is anything to be done, then other institutions will deal with these situations. But you will pass on the information about these people to the other organizations? To be fair, nowadays everybody is on Facebook, everyone reads there, and anyone who wants to will use it to draw conclusions. I just want to believe that Ukrainians are clear-headed, and during these hard times our country is going through, that they'll understand what should and shouldn't be said. But you haven't explained specifically what is or isn't allowed to be talked about, except the part about troop movements. I remember when we introduced atoll press cards for journalists at the Ministry of Defense in 2014, when I was an advisor, we clearly spelled out in a document that was given to each journalist what they could and couldn't say or talk about. We explained what they had or didn't have the right to talk about. According to the existing laws on anti-terrorist activity at that time. And you essentially are not explaining right now any further information, aside from not talking about military movement. So, does that mean anything else can be talked about? By and large, for the ordinary citizen, nothing has changed with the introduction of martial law. People are saying now exactly what they could say before. Freedom of speech has not been forbidden. Okay, we'll keep that in mind.
What do you think?
As far as I understand, so the inclusion of this article in the President's order and the Security and Defense Council order means that there could be measures introduced that restrict this right. But there haven't been so far, as my colleague has said, and as far as I understand it, specific measures have not been taken to restrict this and other rights that are provided for by the Constitution during this period of martial law. I think the challenge is in the lack of information and understanding, because there were lots of titles in the media that rights could be restricted. These rights were included in the President's order, and so on and so forth. And despite the President having said that no rights will be restricted, it's probably somewhere in between, and people don't know. I don't have all the information, and at the same time, there have been recommendations from the military, but also from government officials at the local and national level to do this or to not do that. For example, I've heard a recommendation for political parties to not be active in one region during martial law in one of the regions that's affected by it. Now, it's not an official restriction, but certainly I would expect that recommendations like that in an environment where there are a lot of questions and not a lot of information, that people would act upon that, or rather potentially not do things that in a time when there are major elections coming up in Ukraine, that political parties would not be, working with youth, doing whatever it is political parties are supposed to do. Yeah, that these recommendations could influence people in a negative way, and so that could be a serious problem.
What about freedom of assembly? Returning to the official statement made by the Ukrainian president, which says that, but there have been communications from local authorities recommending against holding meetings or gatherings.
чи мітинги.
Again, recommending against is not prohibiting. In our country, there is a certain procedure according to which all public events are organized. Usually, it must be agreed to by local authorities. If they decline permission, then this is already a restriction of this right.
Якщо вони його не надають, це в принципі
Ну, це їх
припинення
право,
цих
це
прав.
їх, ну, що, це їх
Well,
законне
that's
право.
their legal right.
Дивлячись тут,
Each
треба казати,
individual
розбиратися
case
по кожному окремому
has to be
випадку,
assessed as to
які
what
підстави
grounds it was
були.
declined on.
Thanks to you for coming to our studio. Thanks to all who watched us. See you next week.